Okinawa, May 1945. The sky tore open with monsoon rain, pounding the ridges so violently it felt like the island itself was under attack. Marines fought not just the enemy, but the mud dragging at their boots, the stench of death rising from bomb craters, and an air so thick with smoke and rot it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Then, cutting through the storm like a blade, came a sound no one ever forgot. A ruthless, ripping roar that didn't crack or sputter. It devoured the noise around it. Japanese officers later confessed, "When we heard that roar, the battle was already decided." The Marines had their own name for the machine that made it the Buzzsaw. The weapon producing that relentless voice was the M1919 Browning, a machine gun born not in the jungles of the Pacific, but in the muddy trenches of Europe. John Moses Browning, one of history's greatest weapons designers, never lived long enough to witness the weapon's ultimate legacy. He died in 1926, leaving behind a design that would outlast him, outfight expectations, and carve its name across some of the most brutal battlegrounds of the 20th century. The original Browning machine gun used in World War I, the water-cooled M1917, was devastatingly effective but unbearably heavy. With its water jacket full, tripod assembled, and ammunition belts carried forward, the entire system weighed more than 90 pounds, a weapon perfect for trench defense but useless for mobile assaults. The U.S. Army wanted something lighter, something infantry could drag forward during an advance. Thus the M1919 was born. Air-cooled, recoil-operated, and chambered for the powerful 30-06 Springfield cartridge. It retained Browning's genius for reliability while shedding the bulk of its predecessor. Over time, the weapon evolved into several variants, but two would become synonymous with the Pacific: the tripod-mounted M1919A4 and the more mobile M1919A6 equipped with a bipod, shoulder stock, and carrying handle. These weapons, though never intended to be light, became exactly the tools Marine assault units needed to survive the unforgiving terrain of island warfare. The Pacific was not like Europe. It was a world of caves, ridges, jungles, tunnels, and reverse slopes where the enemy could vanish underground and reappear behind you without warning. The Japanese defensive philosophy relied on concealment, endurance, and ambush. They preferred to let American forces walk into kill zones rather than meet them on open ground. In such an environment, mobility meant survival, and suppressive fire meant life. The Browning delivered exactly that, hour after hour, belt after belt. Japanese forces relied heavily on the Type 99 light machine gun and the Type 92 heavy machine gun, but both suffered limitations. The Type 99's 20-round magazine emptied in seconds, leaving the gunner constantly reloading in the middle of an assault. The Type 92, though accurate, overheated quickly and suffered from the fine coral dust that clogged its mechanism. By contrast, the Browning's 250-round belts meant firing did not need to stop until the belt ran dry, and even then, belts could be spliced together, creating nearly continuous streams of fire. In battle, Marines discovered they could fire 2,000 to 3,000 rounds in a single engagement using just 2 spare barrels in disciplined bursts. Then came Okinawa, the final, deadliest battle of the Pacific. When American forces landed on April 1st, 1945, they expected another swift advance. Instead, they walked into the jaws of the Shuri Line, a network of fortifications so deep and complex that some tunnels stretched miles underground. Among its many fortified ridges, one hill would soon become infamous: Sugar Loaf. Barely 50 feet high, only a few hundred yards long, it appeared insignificant on the map, but in reality dominated the entire western flank. Together with its sister ridges, Half Moon and Horseshoe, Sugar Loaf formed a triangle of interlocking fire. Any Marine advancing toward one ridge was exposed to guns on the others, and tunnels allowed Japanese troops to appear anywhere, anytime. Between May 12 and May 21, Marines launched 14 assaults on Sugar Loaf. They lost thousands of men. Some companies emerged with only 7 or 8 survivors still able to fight. And yet, time after time, one weapon enabled them to climb those coral slopes, survive the crossfire, and hold whatever inches they gained, the M1919. Every attack began the same way, machine gun teams crawling forward under fire, dragging 80 pounds of gear through mud that swallowed their legs. Once in place, they braced the bipod, slammed the feed tray shut, and opened fire into the ridges ahead. The Japanese learned to fear the Browning not just for its lethality, but for its refusal to fall silent. In diaries and interrogations, they called it the never-ending machine gun. To the Marines fighting on those slopes, it was more than a weapon. It was a promise that somewhere ahead, someone was still fighting, still holding, still refusing to yield. The battle for Sugar Loaf did not unfold in sweeping advances or dramatic breakthroughs. It happened inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat, under conditions that made even the bravest Marines question whether the ridge was cursed. The approaches were narrow and exposed. Rain turned the ground into a treacherous slime. Japanese machine guns hammered the slopes from every angle. Mortars bracketed the approaches with terrifying precision. And yet, day after day, Marine officers ordered their men forward because they understood the simple, brutal truth. If Sugar Loaf didn't fall, the entire division would bleed out where it stood. On May 14, the Marines launched a major push. The 22nd Marines reached the crest twice, only to be driven off by counterattacks emerging from tunnels behind them. Machine gun crews on the slopes fired until their barrels glowed dull red. In some cases, the heat radiating from the gun itself caused the ammunition belts to steam in the rain. Men passed spare barrels forward through hands trembling from exhaustion, knowing that even a few seconds of silence could invite disaster. By May 16, the fighting had reached a crescendo of violence. A single Browning team from Company G reportedly fired 4,000 rounds in one afternoon. Their position, perched on a shallow lip of coral halfway up the slope, was all that prevented a Japanese flank attack from rolling downhill and crushing the companies below. One Marine fed belts into the gun until his gloves burned. Another changed barrels repeatedly, even as the mud mixed with the gun's scorching residue. They held until nightfall, and when darkness fell, they did not sleep. They waited, listening for movement in the rain, fingers on the trigger. May 18 was worse. Japanese commanders, recognizing the danger posed by the Browning teams, ordered a coordinated counterattack. At dawn, a Japanese lieutenant emerged from a tunnel, sword raised, leading 30 soldiers in a desperate charge. They ran straight into 3 M1919s firing in overlapping arcs. None made it past 20 yards. In the chaos, Corporal Tony Stein, a Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima, fired a borrowed Browning until his 4th barrel warped from heat. Even then, he refused to abandon the line. The machine gun had become more than a tool. It was the beating heart of Marine defensive power, and Stein knew that if it went silent, Sugar Loaf would be lost. Rain fell day and night. Marines fought in a world where the ground squished beneath their knees, where helmets filled with water, where trenches collapsed into sticky pits. They hauled ammunition boxes through mud that tried to steal their boots, their balance, their hope. And yet they kept moving, kept firing, kept dragging the Buzzsaw forward 1 yard at a time. By May 20, entire companies had been reduced to 20 or 30 effectives. Marines rotated machine gunners in shifts, not for tactical reasons, but because no human being could remain behind the trigger that long without collapsing. The M1919 fired through fatigue, through terror, through the constant drums of mortars and the unearthly screams of Banzai charges cutting through the storm. The gun crews, numb from exhaustion, found a strange rhythm in its mechanical thrum. The Browning's voice echoed across the ridges at night, and Marines far from the front took comfort in its presence. It meant someone was still fighting, someone was still holding, someone was still refusing to surrender even an inch of coral. For the Japanese, the psychological weight of the M1919 became unbearable. Diaries captured from dead soldiers reveal repeated references to the gun. American machine guns never stop. The belts seem endless. We waited for pauses that never came. Some soldiers refused to leave tunnels once the guns started firing. Others attempted suicide rather than face the pace. Machine gun fire on the slopes. For many, the buzzsaw became less a weapon and more an omen, an announcement that death was already on its way. And yet the ridge held. The Japanese were determined, disciplined, and deeply entrenched. Every foothold the Marines gained was met by a counterattack launched from a tunnel only yards away. Marines learned to expect the unexpected, to expect defenders to burst from holes in the ground, from behind rocks, from cave mouths hidden so well that men crawled past them without noticing. The Browning crews responded again and again. Their bursts became the punctuation marks of survival. Long after the mortars fell silent, long after rifles emptied their magazines, the machine gun kept speaking into the night. Sugar Loaf was becoming a place where time dissolved, where the world narrowed to mud, blood, rain, and the metallic ripping sound that defined the battle's heartbeat. And still, despite 9 straight days of failure, the Marines did not stop. By the morning of May 21, the Marines realized something had to change. They had thrown everything at Sugar Loaf: rifle platoons, flame teams, Sherman tanks, artillery barrages, and each attempt had ended the same way. Shattered units withdrawing under fire while the Japanese reoccupied their positions. The problem wasn't simply Sugar Loaf itself. It was the triangle of death formed by Horseshoe Ridge and Half Moon Ridge, each providing flanking fire that turned assaults into slaughter. So the Marines changed tactics. Instead of attacking one ridge at a time, they would strike all 3 simultaneously, denying the Japanese their deadly overlap. It was a plan born from desperation, exhaustion, and sheer necessity. That morning, flamethrower tanks rolled toward Horseshoe Ridge, blasting cave mouths with sheets of burning fuel. Mortars hammered Half Moon. Riflemen advanced under covering fire from both Browning machine guns and BARs. And in the chaos of this coordinated storm, something finally shifted. For the first time in 9 days, Browning teams managed to dig into positions on both sister ridges, establishing firing lines directly into Sugar Loaf's vulnerable flanks. This changed everything. The Browning had always been deadly, but now, with multiple guns firing from elevated, cross-enfilading angles, it became unstoppable. Japanese soldiers who rushed out of tunnels found themselves caught between intersecting fields of tracers. No matter where they turned, the buzzsaw was already waiting. As Marines pressed up the muddy slopes one more time, the machine guns on Horseshoe and Half Moon laid down a constant stream of suppressive fire. Belts ran dry. New belts snapped into place. Hot barrels were swapped for cool ones. Smoke poured from the guns as the rain hissed against their metal. The Browning's rhythm turned into the soundtrack of the final assault. At midday, Japanese forces launched their largest counterattack yet. Nearly 300 men poured out of tunnels on Sugar Loaf's reverse slope, screaming "Banzai" as they charged down the hill. It was meant to break the Marines once and for all. They never made it. 6 Browning machine guns, positioned perfectly after days of failure and bloodshed, opened up at once. Tracers laced the hillside, converging on the charging formation. The sound was deafening, a wall of mechanical fury that drowned out rain and screams alike. Marines later said the tracers looked like glowing whips slicing through the storm. The entire counterattack collapsed in 3 minutes. Men fell in piles, clutching their rifles, their helmets, their stomachs. Others tried to crawl back to the tunnel entrances only to be cut down by overlapping arcs. The few who survived the initial bursts attempted to hide in shell holes or behind rocks, but the Browning teams were mercilessly precise after 10 days of fighting on the same slopes. No movement escaped their eyes. By late afternoon, Marine squads reached the crest of Sugar Loaf and found, to their disbelief, that there was no immediate counterattack. The tunnel network still existed below them, but the defenders were in chaos. Many had died in the Banzai rush. Others were cut off from their officers. Some retreated deeper into the Shuri line, hoping to regroup. For the first time, Sugar Loaf belonged to the Marines. Throughout the night, Browning teams held the ridge against sporadic attacks. The machine guns fired so often that gun crews rotated every hour to prevent collapse from exhaustion. Rain soaked their uniforms. Mud glued itself to their ankles. The ground around them was littered with brass casings, ammunition links, broken tools, and the bodies of men, American and Japanese alike, who had died fighting over what, at first glance, appeared to be nothing more than a small, ugly mound of coral. But Sugar Loaf was not nothing. It was the hinge on which the entire western Shuri line swung. With it captured, the Japanese left flank had collapsed. The way toward Shuri Castle, the heart of the defensive system, lay open. The Marines had broken the seemingly unbreakable line, and the machine gun that had made it possible was the same one designed back in 1919. The M1919. Browning did not simply fire bullets on Sugar Loaf. It fired hope, rhythm, and endurance into a battle where both sides were running out of all three. Marines said they could identify Browning crews even without seeing them, because wherever the gun's mechanical roar echoed, that was where the line was holding. The Buzzsaw had spoken, and the ridge had finally fallen silent beneath its voice. When Sugar Loaf finally fell, the cost became painfully clear. More than 2,662 Marines had been killed or wounded on the slopes around the ridge. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of survivors. Some platoons were rebuilt 3 times over during the 10-day battle. Corpsmen performed miracles in mud-filled craters, dragging wounded men from under machine gun fire. Runners braved mortar bursts to bring ammunition belts to Browning crews who could not afford to let their guns go silent even for seconds. On the Japanese side, more than 7,000 defenders died in the immediate Sugar Loaf sector. Many fell to artillery or rifle fire, but countless others died facing the relentless bursts of the M1919. Diaries found on bodies spoke of despair. The American machine gun never sleeps. If we hear its voice, we cannot advance. It fires longer than our courage holds. Sugar Loaf's fall broke the Shuri line psychologically as much as tactically. Japanese commanders had believed the line unshakable. They had engineered a defense meant to rival anything seen on Iwo Jima or Peleliu. But the constant, overlapping, unbroken streams of Browning fire slowly eroded their ability to coordinate counterattacks. Tunnels that once funneled reinforcements now became traps, because the moment defenders emerged, they were shredded by interlocking arcs of fire. From Sugar Loaf, Marines pushed deeper into the Shuri defenses. The Browning remained at the center of every advance. On ridges where tanks could not climb, where mortars struggled to angle correctly, and where rifles lacked the suppressive power needed to dislodge entrenched defenders, the M1919 became the deciding voice of the battlefield. The psychological effect did not vanish with Sugar Loaf. In later battles across Okinawa, Japanese defenders frequently abandoned positions after hearing the first long bursts of Browning fire. Survivors told interrogators that the consistency of American machine gun fire, its refusal to stop, its mechanical certainty, broke their morale far more effectively than artillery. For the Marines, the Browning became a symbol of endurance. Men who had fought at Sugar Loaf wrote that the sound of the gun at night became a kind of comfort, not because it was pleasant, but because it meant the line was still secure. As Eugene Sledge later wrote about his own time on Okinawa, the machine gun fire at night told us who was holding and who was still alive. When the fighting on Okinawa finally ended 6 weeks later, the bloodiest ground battle of the Pacific, the M1919, had earned a place in military history that no designer in 1919 could have predicted. It would go on to fight in Korea, where Chinese soldiers nicknamed it the American gun that sings all night. It would serve in Vietnam, sometimes mounted on helicopters, sometimes carried by infantry. It would appear in conflicts around the world throughout the Cold War, long after newer weapons had replaced it. But among all its battles, its most legendary, most defining moment was the mud-soaked hell of Sugar Loaf. There, on a ridge so small it didn't appear important on the map, a machine gun nearly 3 decades old became a decisive weapon, not because it was the most advanced, but because it was devastatingly reliable. It could fire through mud, through rain, through exhaustion, through fear. It refused to stop, and because it refused to stop, the men behind it refused to break. The Browning's legacy on Okinawa lives not merely in the rounds it fired, but in the thousands of lives it helped save. Marines who survived wrote decades later that the Buzzsaw's roar haunted them, not as trauma, but as memory. It was the sound that meant reinforcements would reach them. It was the sound that meant the Japanese were pinned. It was the sound that meant they might live to see another day. And for thousands of Japanese soldiers, it was the last sound they ever heard. So the next time someone hears that classic Hollywood machine gun firing sound, remember that it's not just a special effect. It's the echo of a hill where Marines fought in mud and blood, where a weapon designed in 1919 shaped the outcome of a battle in 1945, and where the Buzzsaw carved its legend into the rain-soaked coral of Sugar Loaf. It's the voice of history, and the reminder that sometimes the most terrifying weapon on the battlefield isn't the newest or the biggest. Sometimes it's the one that simply refuses to stop. Before you go, take a moment to breathe, because stories like this aren't just history, they're reminders of what determination sounds like when everything feels impossible. If this battle pulled you in, if the roar of the Browning or the grit of the Marines hit you anywhere deeper than expected, let the world know by keeping this story alive. And tell me this, if you were standing on that rain-soaked ridge, hearing the Buzzsaw echo through the storm, what's the one thought you think would push you forward?